If you or your children grew up in Australia during the 80s, there's a very strong likelihood that my guest would have been a regular on your TV screen. He's a children's entertainer who encouraged kids to wash their face in orange juice and belly flop on a pizza, long before groups like the Wiggles came onto the scene. In 1988, he won an ARIA Award for Best Children's Album, and a further 2 ARIA Awards followed in 1989 and 1992. My guest today is entertainer Peter Combe. Hello, Peter.
Hi, Julia.
Welcome to Footprints in South Australia.
Nice to be here.
Thank you for joining us.
Right.
You are a household name to a generation of children who are now young adults. You have been recognised by a number of ARIA Awards and an OAM, and crossed paths with folks like the Beatles producer George Martin and the Seekers. Where did it all begin?
Well, I think it really began at Hectorville Primary School in 1973. I wanted to actually write a children's operetta with my class of kids. And so I did. And it was based on a book called Bows Against the Barons by an English writer called Geoffrey Trees. We ended up meeting actually in England about 7 or 8 years ago. And it was just a story of Robin Hood from a different point of view. And that was the first group of children's songs I wrote. I think I had this sort of second or sixth sense that this was something I would enjoy doing, and I'd like to think I might have been quite good at it, because the first few songs I wrote, I thought they had potential, but the thing is, that at that time, no one was doing it. When I say no one was doing it, I mean no one who was well known. There was no one who was a household name as a children's songwriter. So I guess 73 Hectorville Primary School was probably the beginnings.
Now, is it true that you taught yourself the guitar?
Yeah, pretty much. I had about 10 classical lessons from a guy called John Della Torre, who actually ended up playing on a track of mine, my Christmas album. And this wasn't John's fault, but that they weren't really of any use to me. I was never going to be a classical guitar player. So yes, basically I was self-taught. I mean, when I say self-taught, I copied people like Paul Simon, Peter and Paul from Peter, Paul and Mary. Just copied other people's styles, and of course your own style evolves out of that.
So your first album, Vagabond, was written for adults. You then turned to writing children's songs, and you've talked about how you created your operetta. What inspired you, though, to move from writing the sort of grown-up songs to children's songs?
It probably had a lot to do with the fact that when I lived in London in the late 70s, I was lucky enough to get a job with the BBC a program called Music Time. I was co-presenting a program with another lady called Catherine Harries. And I guess I couldn't help but think about my teaching background, my love of children, because at that stage I had 2 of my own. And I just enjoyed writing for them. There's sort of a joy about writing for children. You know, you tend to write happy songs. If you write for adults, a lot of them are kind of a mixture of happy and not so happy. So I guess doing Music Time was a huge factor in me writing more and more children's songs. And I was also sending them back to the ABC in Sydney, and I got quite a strong reaction to them. In fact, one song I wrote. This is before I even went to Sydney, back in 76, with a little song called I Can Run As Fast As You, I Can Run As Fast As You, I Can Run As Fast As You, running on the spot. And that became a kind of a place called staple. And it was performed on the program for years and years and years. And that was the first successful children's song I had. Really simple little thing, 2 chords. But I guess I started thinking, I think I have some ability in this field.
And I suppose you had children, and you could recognise what was attractive for those children. I think there's a real skill, and I see this in people who write novels for children, is that actually they are quite simple, but it's not easy. It's a real process to think about connecting with children.
I think there's 2 things about that. First of all, not all children's songs are simple. I mean, in my case, I've written a number of songs that structurally are quite intricate. The actual what the song's saying may be simple, but musically they can be quite subtle and quite, as I said, quite intricate. And I mean, the writing process is that sometimes a song just drops out of nowhere. You don't know why it happens, and it's happened to me a few times. You're just simply grateful that it has. But most songs, whether they're children or adult songs, take a lot of writing, editing, being tough on yourself, thinking, oh, this is not quite good enough, changing a chorus to a verse or something. So they're quite challenging to write, if you're going to write anything that's any good. And that's, I guess, the great myth about writing good children's songs is just as hard as writing good adult songs.
It sounds to me that's probably the key to your success, is that you took your audience quite seriously and cared about them when you were developing your song.
I have a great respect for a children's audience. I think, in fact, you have almost a bigger responsibility writing for, say, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds than you do for adults, because you're part of their learning about music and learning about the structure of music and learning to enjoy it. So that's why I spend hours and hours on songs to get them as close as I can to what I think's right. And if the song doesn't work out as well as I like, I just simply don't record it. I think I should say that an observation of contemporary songwriters, often songwriters, they record stuff, and I think to myself, they should have gone back and rewritten that. They could have improved it. It wasn't quite good enough. So in that sense, you have to be your own strictest critic. Now, luckily, I have a wife who is also a really strict critic, and she doesn't let me get away with anything. And that's a really good thing to have. Yes. But I'm pretty strict on myself too, because I think it matters, because you're singing these songs to young children, and it's a formative part of their lives, and you want the songs to be really, really good.
Yes. So now you're playing to the same songs to the same audience, although they're somewhat older, in pubs. How did that come about?
Well, I'm not doing that anymore. I should say that was a phase. That phase finished probably only about 3 years ago. Right. But what happened was, to keep this long story short, I did this strange gig at Schützenfest, this summer festival in Adelaide, German beer drinking festival. And I can remember thinking, why would you ask a children's singer-songwriter to sing at a German beer drinking festival? I still don't know the answer to that. Anyway, I was 2 years in a row. And the second time I did it, it was like a 42-degree day. And I decided to shift the show inside. I couldn't imagine anyone wanting to sit out in the sun when it was that hot. So I did. And the audience were almost entirely adults. And they literally went crazy. They actually stormed the stage. And so I got off, I thought, wow. What was that? What was going on? And I realised that they simply loved hearing the songs again that they grew up on. And that, fast forwarding, ended up being me doing about something like 115 of these adult 18-plus big kids night out concerts all over Australia with my band. And they were wonderful. You had these young people, mid to late 20s, coming along and simply reliving their childhood with incredible joy. It was a bit like a religious experience without the religion. And they'd come along and they'd sing all these well-known songs like Newspaper Mama, Spaghetti Bolognese, Toffee Apple, Mr. Clickety Cane, Juicy Juicy Greengrass, and they sing with just incredible joy. It was really quite touching.
Isn't that wonderful?
And what I realised is that I learned something, that young children, when they listen to an album or a song they like when they're very young, they don't just listen to it 4 or 5 times like we adults might buy an album. And they hear it 100 times, in the car, when they're going to bed, all around the house. So 20 years later, when they come, they realise they know these because they're implanted in their brains. So they are wonderful experiences.
Yes, and it would bring back really lovely memories for those children.
It was. They're really quite delightful. But I knew those concerts had a shelf life. Right. And the shelf life was, when they, say, got to mid-30s and they start having their own children, and they've got a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, are you going to go out on a Saturday night to hear me sing at 10 o'clock, get home at 12:30, and then be woken up at 6 by your 3-year-old the next morning? Of course, the answer is you're probably not. Probably not. So I thought that's the time to kind of let this lovely idea just slowly sort of go away. But it was a lovely 10 to 12 years.
That's wonderful. Now, a moment ago I mentioned that you crossed paths with the Seekers, and I believe they recorded one of your songs. That must have been a very proud moment.
It was lovely. Yes, I came across Keith Potker from the Seekers, who I don't know Keith well. I met him just briefly, actually, at a pub with Pete Titchener. And he's a lovely guy. And somehow I got in contact with him when I was living in England in 1977 and went out to his house in Hampstead Heath. And he did rough recordings of two of my songs. One was called Vagabond, one was called Castaway. And Vagabond was recorded by the Seekers in one of their many combinations. It wasn't Judith Durham. The song became a minor hit. I think it got to about 36 on the charts or something. But I got to know Keith a little bit, and then we reunited only about 6 months ago. So that's how I came across Keith Potker from the Seekers.
So it sounds like, had you continued to write songs for adults, you may have also had a successful career.
Oh, well, it's the adult songwriting career is a quite different sort of career. There's masses of people trying to do it. I mean, I went to the UK thinking, I'd like to be the world's next Paul Simon. Well, so did another few other thousand people want to be the world's next Paul Simon. But I should tell you, though, on this same track, and you may be asked this question anyway, if you want a name-dropping type story, in 1989, I went to Sydney to receive an aria for newspaper Mama. And what happened was the key speaker was George Martin, the Beatles producer, and arguably the most famous producer in the world, definitely the world's most famous group. Anyway, he gave a speech, and after all the winners gathered in this one room, and it just happened to be the year that Kylie Minogue broke. She suddenly became really huge. And in this room, all the journalists sort of crowded around her like bees to a hive. And so he was just left standing by himself. And I'm thinking, this is George Martin. He produced Abbey Road, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, arguably the two most famous, greatest pop albums ever made, and he's being ignored. No one wants to talk to him. This is extraordinary. So I thought, well, I'm not going to do something silly like ask for his autograph. That would be really kind of banal. Anyway, we had quite a long chat, probably 45-minute chat, and we talked about the orchestration behind the Beatles song A Day in the Life, which is on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And it was wonderful. I learned how he did it, because I asked him all these questions. And I think he was honestly pleased that someone wanted to talk about music, not something trivial.
Or so even the Beatles, but about his craft.
About his craft, what he did as a producer stroke arranger. And I learned that in this song, they took the orchestra, the LSO, took their lowest notes and had X number of bars to get to their highest note. And it was just a wonderful to hear this explanation. Yeah. So that was quite an honour.
A wonderful opportunity.
Yeah.
So now I'd like to ask you about the item that you've brought today. It's over here and get this, your Robin Hood and the Men of Greenwood book, with a bookmark in a special
I am. I must have started rereading at some point. I would have, yeah.
Can you tell me about that one?
Well, I grew up, this was my very favourite book growing up as a child, and it's kind of very oldie-weldy version of Robin, so it has a feeling of being really authentic. But there's a connection with this and my Bows Against the Barons. I was saying it was a story by Geoffrey Trees. From that, I wrote my first children's operetta. And one of the songs from Bows Against the Barons ended up being on the newspaper Mama album, a song called Robin Hood's Dream. And definitely I was very, very inspired by reading this book. I think it definitely had an influence on my life philosophy too. I've got very, very strong leftish socialist leanings. And I mean, when you talk about giving from the rich to give to the poor, I think there's a fundamental truth in that. I mean, it sounds simplistic, but I think that's we live in a country where there's incredible inequality. So this has always been a little bit of a backdrop to my life.
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned that, because my next question is around your passion for advocacy for children, speaking for children. Yep. But you've also been an advocate in respect to the climate, and I understand you wrote a song called Free David Hicks.
I did, yes. I wrote a song called, so I thought that was a really awful part of our history, that this young guy who went off overseas and ended up being dumped in Guantanamo Bay for 6 or so years nothing was ever proved about whether he did anything wrong, and he was just never defended. I thought it was just an awful thing. I met his dad a couple of times, a really delightful guy, and I just felt for him. So that was how the song Free David. That song then got turned. I took the melody, changed the words, it got turned into a song called Little Bird, which appeared on my Kittywinks album. So I thought that never waste a good melody.
That's right. I'll rescue you.
So I plagiarised myself.
That's allowed, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it's absolutely allowed. I've done it more than once.
So how important is it for you to use your platform in this way as an advocate?
I think, I generally think, without trying to sound pretentious, that I have an obligation. I mean, we're living in an environment where the planet is in mortal danger. And I've just read David Attenborough's latest book, Life on the Planet, A Witness Statement, and it absolutely spells it out. And I think because I've got grandchildren ranging in age from 5 to 16, I really have an obligation to actually be quite public about this. So I wrote a song on the last album called Sun Comes Up, Sun Goes Down, which is a climate change song for children, because we can't ignore it. And I just despair of currently Australia that neither side of politics are really serious about it at all. The Conservative side have never been serious, but the Labor side are, I think, just pretending. They're not really serious about it. And the planet's in mortal danger. But you don't hear them saying that. And it's so, I mean, when you've got the entire scientific community saying pretty much the same thing, along with, say, someone like David Attenborough agreeing with Greta Thunberg, it's a big deal. And because my life's work is about children, I feel I have this really strong obligation to be very public about it and try and do my tiny little bit to somehow make things better. So that's my sermon for the day.
Well, I have a lot of respect for you in that you do speak out for the things that you believe in, and that you've consistently held these values, and that you've used your opportunity to make a difference really in the world.
Well, there's something else I feel really strongly about, and to do with my work, is that children's music has never really been taken very seriously, not in the same way as children's literature is. And obviously children's literature is incredibly important, should be taken seriously, but children's songs are sort of regarded as like a novelty kind of area. And when you write for children, nothing could be further from the truth. You struggle with songs, you struggle with melodies. When I record, I'm very careful about studios, musicians I use, mixing the song, getting it absolutely the best I can. So to see it kind of trivialised by much of the media is kind of sad. And it's been like that for 30 years. But I keep on trying to change it.
Well, it sounds you've made a difference for many children with the care that you've given your job, I suppose.
Yes. What is it? I consider it my life's work.
Yes. Now, you were all set to tour nationally in 2020, and as many in the arts, COVID restrictions put an end to your plans. But you used this opportunity to establish an online presence.
I did, yeah.
So how does a virtual concert compare to performing in front of a live audience?
It's obviously less satisfying, because you don't have the lovely... I mean, all performers know that we love the response of the audience. That's what live performing is all about. You go out, you sing a song, and you think, well, do the audience like this song or not? Do they respond to it? So doing it online, I did 3 different things. I did a thing called the Spangle Road Couch Choir. You know those things where you have a screen, there's about 100 people, tiny little bits of them. I did one of those. That was great fun. And Spangle Road is a song from newspaper Mama. And then I did a lullaby time where I sang some of my gentler songs, just straight to camera, if you like. And also then I did a story time. And but they're difficult because it's like being on television. You're not speaking to anyone in particular. But I think it was worth doing because in all over Australia last year, people were particularly the arts really took a huge hit. It was very, very hard as a performer to do nothing for month after month after month. So most performers, they did this kind of thing. And it was enjoyable, but in a restricted sort of way.
So finally, do you have any unfulfilled career ambitions?
Unfulfilled career ambitions. Let me think. Actually, in a funny way, it makes me think of a project that almost got off the ground about 3 years ago. I had this lady in America who was very keen to actually make me big in America. And she worked really hard and never quite achieved it. At one stage, she had this guy who wanted to bring me to New York and do a live concert in New York. Now, that would have been fantastic. Like, Peter Combe, live in New York, or live at Carnegie Hall or something. It didn't happen, but I would say that got me the appetite for doing something major in, say, America. I've always had a passion to do something in the UK as well. Sadly, the UK, they drive you nuts about kids' music because they're incredibly conservative. If you ask the average English person, who's your most well-known children's singer-songwriter, they all say Rolf Harris. Now, he's no longer, can't do it anymore, so there's no one. But there's just this incredible conservatism. They don't want to hear anything new, and I find that really sad. So I guess to do something major in the UK one, if I ever got a chance to do live in New York, I would leap at it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure talking
to you
and hearing your story today. Thank you so much for being part of Footprints in South Australia.
My great pleasure.